Avengers Endgame was pretty bad. Now that might be an unpopular position, but if you cast aside all the hype and emotion tied to the MCU, this movie just has huge problems that I think a lot of people are overlooking simply because... But while you were getting that sweet, sweet fan service, you probably didn't notice that almost nothing in this movie made sense. Now, I'm a big fan of the MCU, and superhero films in general, but just because I'm a fan doesn't mean I can't point out flaws, and just because this film has moments that you like, doesn't mean that it's good. So get ready to have those rose-tinted glasses shoved right up your ass. So picking up where we left off in the last film, half of all life in the universe has been eliminated by Thanos. And after the Avengers learn he's destroyed the Infinity Stones, they drop him like a sack of potatoes. Right off the bat, I have two huge issues. Firstly, wouldn't destroying the Infinity Stones have horrible ramifications on the universe? The Ancient One specifically says,
"The Infinity Stones create what you experience as the flow of time. Remove one of the stones, and that flow splits."
Notice she says Infinity Stones. So all of these things are super important, and removing just one of them would be catastrophic. But I guess all of them being essentially deleted doesn't have any effect on anything? So let me get this straight. This film tells us that these stones are absolutely critical to the universe, but at the same time shows us that the universe continues all the same without them? That's confusing. This scene would make more sense if she was just talking about the Time Stone. That seems like the only one that needs to be returned so it can be used to beat Dormammu. The rest just seem to sit in labs and tombs and create more problems than they solve. This is really dumb, and unfortunately it's not explained well at all. Anyway, my second major issue is that killing Thanos so early is a horrible idea, as it deflates all the tension surrounding the antagonist for the rest of the film. This nigh unstoppable villain is subdued and killed within seconds while making his goddamn lunch. Wouldn't it have been more compelling if the heroes spent most of the film trying to find a clever way to defeat this guy? Seems like they sacrificed the ultimate underdog story for shock value. To make matters worse, they end up having a big fight with a younger version of Thanos at the end of the film anyway. So if you're just gonna have that same conflict in the end, why strip away all that character development? The younger Thanos doesn't even truly understand who he's fighting.
I don't even know who you are.
Sure, you can say that he relearned some of those memories, but it's just not the same as having the actual experiences. And overall, he ends up feeling like a different character. Coming off of Infinity War, there were so many opportunities for reprisals and dialogue, and they don't go anywhere. This interaction goes nowhere. This goes nowhere. In these moments, go nowhere. It's like if in Return of the Jedi, they killed Vader at the beginning of the film, and brought back a younger version of him from the prequels to fight Luke. It just doesn't make any sense, and it loses all emotional impact. But enough about inconsistent rules and how they completely ruin their villain. 5 years have passed, and now our heroes need to travel back in time to get the Infinity Stones so they can undo what Thanos did. In case you were wondering, the only reason we jumped ahead 5 years in the story is because that's precisely how long it took this rat to save the day. I wish I were joking, but this is actually the key event that sets this whole plot in motion. Anyway, with Scott back in the picture, he suggests to Tony that time travel might be possible via the quantum realm, and thus the time heist takes shape. But when you think about their plan for more than 10 seconds, and how the story gets pushed along by random, unpredictable events, the whole movie feels contrived and unnecessary. The times and places they decide to get most of these Infinity Stones are the most inopportune, making things harder than they need to be. And if they do pick a decent time and place, something ridiculously inconvenient happens because, well, movie. Just so I'm not being an asshole though, let's examine the plan for each stone, shall we?
I've got the power!
So Rocket suggests going back to Morag at the beginning of the first Guardians film to get the Power Stone. Not a completely bad idea, except the script conveniently forces Nebula to spill the beans to a younger Thanos about what the Avengers are doing and the history that led to it. Not only is this such a lazy, forced way to get Thanos back into the story, but again, it makes me question why the writers killed him off in the first place. Oh, that's right. Shit, if not for this random issue, this part of the mission would have been like taking candy from a baby. While we're here though, I just want to stress that Nebula doesn't attempt to use her time suit again while being beamed up by Thanos' ship. Seems like it would be worth at least one more try. And hell, I mean if she was really devoted to not letting Thanos win, she also could have just killed herself. I know that's a little dark, but Gamora was ready to kill herself to stop Thanos, so why not?
I'm back. Back in the New York groove.
So because our heroes are fools and we need to pack this movie with tons of fan service, they decide to try for the space, mind, and time stones when they're all in one place. New York City in 2012. This might seem like a good idea, at first, except for the fact that it increases the chances of failure by 100%. Not only is the entire world watching because of the Jatari attack, but younger versions of our heroes and villains are everywhere. Wouldn't it have been safer to acquire these stones at neutral times? I mean, most of these things just sit around in labs for decades. I'm sure Tony would be able to find out precisely where and when. The Space Stone could have been retrieved at any time between the 1940s and the first Avengers film, which is what they end up having to do anyway, so it just further proves my point. The Mind Stone could have been retrieved between Avengers 1 and Age of Ultron, you know, when it was just sitting on a table. However, when it comes to the Time Stone, it would only make sense to get it from the events of Infinity War, because that's the only time that they knew where it was. They're kinda taking a huge risk thinking they can get it in 2012. None of them even knew about Doctor Strange until Infinity War, and they couldn't possibly be sure he lived at that same address during that time. In 2012, there are still 3 of these Sanctum buildings across the world, and these people are often drifting in between dimensions. I mean, Strange had to go to Nepal just to meet the Ancient One. So isn't it extremely lucky that the Time Stone is in New York during this time, and the hard-boiled egg is there to give it up with seemingly little persuasion?
Lord, it's a miracle!
I am reality.
In a drunken speech, Thor suggests going back to Asgard in 2013 to get the Reality Stone. Now, while on the bright side, this squeezed in some character work, it doesn't make a ton of sense logically. Why go to yet another location full of powerful heroes and villains when you could have picked someplace safer? Again, isn't it ridiculously convenient that Thor's mom is just cool with the whole time travel thing? If she called Odin or young Thor for help, they'd be fucked. Poor Rocket would have been turned into a coonskin hat. Really, the Reality Stone could have been retrieved from the Collector at any point between Thor 2 and Infinity War. Thor knows that it would be there too because his goddamn friends gave it to the guy.
Why would he go to nowhere?
Because for years, the Reality Stone's been safely stored there with a man called the Collector.
I know I'd be taking my chances with David Bowie over arguably the most powerful race in the universe.
I'm a soul man.
Nebula suggests going to Vormir in 2014 to get the Soul Stone. Really, this is the only stone where the location and even the time leave no better option. But unfortunately, that doesn't stop the conveniences in the writing. Of course, the 2 people that care deeply for one another happen to be the ones picked to go to Vormir so they could make the sacrifice. I mean, if they had sent Nebula and War Machine instead, the mission would be a complete flop. No one except Thanos could possibly have known that it required a sacrifice, so this is just dumb luck. Beyond the plan for each stone, though, it's established that they need Pym particles to time travel, and there's a big deal made about them only having enough Pym particles to pull off the time heist once.
Pym particles, all right? And ever since Hank Pym got snapped out of existence, this is it. This is what we have. We're not making any more.
Scott, calm down.
Sorry. We've got enough for 1 round trip each. That's it.
However, later in the film, our heroes need more anyway because, surprise, surprise, their initial plan fails. So you're telling me that no one thought that they should A, figure out how to make more Pym particles, or B, go back and get more before starting the time heist? I mean, we just saw Tony build a time machine in what seemed like a week, and he conveniently guessed what time and place had more Pym particles too. This is just a shitty way of making things seem more dire than they really are. It only gets worse when later the evil Nebula is able to send Thanos' massive ship and army to the present when we were told repeatedly that they had a finite amount of these Pym particles. How does one little jar of this shit allow you to shrink all of this, but can't transport a few people multiple times? I guess we just have to write the movie for them and say that Thanos backwards engineered more Pym particles. But we all know that wasn't communicated in the film. Also, if it was so easy to backwards engineer these things,
You couldn't have done that earlier?
basically, the only reason our heroes succeed in their plans is because they get ridiculously lucky at every turn. Conversely, the only reason we have any conflict in this story is because one of our heroes randomly spazzes out and attracts the attention of a younger Thanos from an alternate timeline. If they had acted with just a little common sense, and if random issues weren't created for the plot, this movie would be over in 10 minutes. However, because this story is designed from the ground up to have as many crowd-pleasing moments as possible, we have to watch 3 hours of events that, in all honesty, really didn't need to happen at all. So you see, the very structure of Endgame is flawed. And you know what they say, a house built on sand will rake in billions of dollars and no one will give a shit. In a universe with so many magical or otherworldly solutions to problems, I can definitely see why it might have been difficult from a writing standpoint to come up with a satisfying ending that felt final. However, I feel like the writers went out of their way to make the audience not care. Let's start with the time travel. In Endgame, time travel is a little different than what we usually see in these types of movies. Traditionally, the goal of time traveling is to cause or prevent something that will affect the future. However, this movie insists that that's a bunch of baloney.
Changing the past doesn't change the future.
Look, we go back, we get the stones before Thanos gets them. Thanos doesn't have the stones. Problem solved.
Bingo.
That's not how it works.
Instead, the idea is that when you go back in time and change something, you simply create an alternate timeline that has no relation to your own. So for example, if you were to go back in time and kill your younger self, there would now be two timelines. The original one where you're still alive, and a new one where you're dead. This makes logical sense, I guess, but it kinda just sucks the life right out of time traveling, doesn't it?
Suck!
The writers of Endgame said that they talked to real physicists about the time travel so that it would make as much sense as possible. And while they continually bust the balls of other films like Terminator or Back to the Future for not making sense,
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit?
at least the time travel rules in those movies were limited and presented real danger. If Marty didn't get his parents back together, he'd fade out of existence. If Sarah Connor got her fucking head blown off, humanity would lose the war against the machines. Actions had consequences. Sure, if you think about time travel too much, you'll go cross-eyed. But obviously adhering to the most current scientific theories isn't as important as making sure there are stakes in your story. At the end of the day, you cared about those characters and what happened to them. I can't say the same about these guys. Ironically, in an attempt to outsmart those other time travel films and make something more based in reality, they seem to forget that when you give your characters too many ways out of a situation, there's no longer any reason to care. For example, with this multiple timeline business, if a character dies, it's now possible to just travel to another timeline and get a version of them back. And when you add a godlike MacGuffin on top of that, it becomes really difficult to give a shit about anything that's happening. To show you what I mean, let's talk about the big character moments in Endgame and why they're all trash.
I am Iron Man.
So the big crescendo of this film and pretty much the whole MCU up until this point is the death of Tony Stark. While I'm sure that this was intended to play as a big emotional moment, to me it played like this. All the characters were crying and some people in my audience were sniffling in my fucking ear, but I felt nothing. The reason I felt nothing was because this event did not need to happen the way it did. In the end battle, when they're trying to get the gauntlet away from Thanos and Tony ends up sacrificing himself, there's absolutely no reason why they couldn't have done the following. A. Have a strong character like Thor or Captain Marvel snap Thanos and his forces away. B. Have Ant-Man shrink the gauntlet so it can't be used by Thanos. C. Have Captain Marvel fly the gauntlet as far away from the battle as possible at light speed. I mean, she destroys Thanos' ship when she arrives, so they can't follow her. Or D, because she's so powerful, just have Captain Marvel fly right through Thanos' chest. If it absolutely had to be the way the film says it does though, then the characters could easily have gone to another timeline and gotten the Tony from a few hours earlier once Thanos and his forces were gone. Sure, I guess that timeline would be changed, but they don't seem to care about the damage they do to these other timelines, so why not? And hell, if for some reason they didn't want to use the time machine again, Doctor Strange could have just used the time stone to bring Tony back. I mean, from previous films, we know that you can use the time stone to reverse time on specific things, even dead characters. So why was this the only way this could have played out again?
If I tell you what happens, it won't happen.
Why?
There was no other way.
How many did we win?
One.
I used to have nothing. And then I got this.
Using that same logic, why can't they bring back Black Widow with the time machine?
It can't be undone. Or that's at least what the red floating guy had to say. Maybe you want to go talk to him, okay? Go grab your hammer, and you go fly and you talk to him.
Oh. So according to this movie, being the sacrifice for the Soul Stone is the most permanent way a person could die in the MCU.
Right.
Did anyone else really take this scene seriously when they realized that Gamora was also sacrificed for the Soul Stone and they brought her back from the past just fine? Stop saying that things won't work when we know they will. People have always complained that these movies had no consequences, but there's an actual in-universe way to reverse death now.
I could do this all day.
It might seem like Cap's ending was fine because, you know, he doesn't die, but just like everything else in the film, it's ruined. Early on, while experimenting with time travel, our heroes also seem to have stumbled upon a way to reverse aging. So again, while everyone was crying into their popcorn, it was plainly obvious that if our heroes really wanted to, they could make Cap young again, or just go get another younger version. You can argue all day long about how he got on that park bench, but in reality, the resulting scene has no emotional impact either way when you think about the multiple ways he could return. It seems like the goal here was to phase out these three characters and provide as much fan service as humanly possible, but when you take into account everything I've mentioned so far, between the plot, the time travel, and the big character moments being so empty, we're kinda just left with fan service. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely some neat and funny moments in here, but I ask you,
At what cost?
are these moments really enough to float a 3-hour movie and pay off 10 years of films? I'll give you the short answer. When you let all this sink in, you start to see Endgame for the shallow experience it really is. Aside from a moment here or there taken out of context, the most important elements are completely broken. These scenes of sacrifice and passing the torch don't work because we've already established that things like old age and even death don't matter anymore. These tear-jerking moments would have been fine, if they weren't completely contradicted and cheapened by everything else we've been shown. That's just bad writing. The problem is even worse though, because this movie is gonna leave a stain. Multiple stains, in fact, and they'll never wash out. So when all the dusted characters return, the MCU is now 5 years older, but to all those people, it's only been a few seconds. This applies to the entire Marvel Universe. What this means is that essentially every film or TV show going forward is going to be faced with two choices. Make light of this event and always have a giant elephant in the room, or center the entire plot around the consequences of the time skip. While a movie like Spider-Man Far From Home got away with playing the time skip mostly for comedy, it ended up feeling weird that literally nobody in Peter Parker's life seemed to be affected by this cataclysmic event. On the flip side, are we going to have to watch T'Challa fight another king for the throne in Black Panther 2? Is Doctor Strange going to have to reclaim his title as Sorcerer Supreme? So many of these projects are going to have to spend time explaining the ramifications of Endgame, and it just seems like they're shooting themselves in the foot. It's a weird status quo, especially if new characters like the X-Men or Fantastic Four will be introduced. I want to forget Endgame and the dumb events that happen going forward, but it seems like they'll never go away. And you know damn well that they're going to milk these character endings for a while too. Overall, it's just pretty disappointing to think that the future of this franchise is going to rely so heavily on horrible decisions. Speaking of which, I'm also pretty pissed about what they did to Gamora. The Guardians films are probably my favorite out of the whole MCU, and I've grown attached to these characters as a result. You can imagine my disappointment then when I saw that they took Gamora and essentially made her a clean slate. The version they got from 2014 never met the Guardians or had any of the character development we saw in previous films, making it utterly pointless. I just kept thinking to myself,
Why would you do that?
now poor James Gunn has to explain away this decision or make a large part of Guardians 3 about trying to bring her back up to speed. It also really doesn't even make sense that she survived Tony's snap either. He barely knew who she was or what she looked like, and for all he knew, she was just another soldier in Thanos' army. But enough is enough. The more I think about this movie, the worse it gets. I don't know what else I can really say about Endgame. It was a cultural event, sure, but it just didn't deliver in the same way that Infinity War did. One area that film really excelled in was getting you invested and making you scared for the characters. Maybe for the first time ever in the MCU. From the opening scene of Infinity War, a massive threat was established, and as the film progressed, things only got more intense. The heroes worked together, combining their powers in clever ways in order to get the upper hand, and if they made bad decisions, it was usually in line with their character or the result of emotions blinding them. It was tragic because everyone seemed to be trying as hard as they could to stop Thanos, but in the end they all failed. In other words, you really cared about what was happening in Infinity War, because for the limited options that the characters had, they made decent choices. However, in Endgame, the same characters have seemingly boundless choices between time travel and the Infinity Stones, yet they act like complete fools. Were there moments in Infinity War that didn't make much sense or weren't explained? Sure, but they were nowhere near as egregious as they are in Endgame. Although the biggest disappointment of all is that people can't seem to tell the difference. This film is almost universally regarded as amazing, but after analyzing it, it's a pretty sloppy fan service movie with not much to get invested in.
I reviewed that script last night and I was not satisfied.
Yeah, well,
I was not satisfied.